Good afternoon, and welcome to our event, Where's the Broadband Money Going? Tracking Impact and Accountability. I'm Mark Jameson, a non-resident senior fellow with AEI. The United States has a cornucopia of broadband programs. Most of the money is in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, about $65 billion. Most of that, about $48 billion, is being overseen by the U.S. Department of Commerce's NTIA. It's distributing that money largely to states for broadband development. The rest of the $65 billion is overseen by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Federal Communications Commission. This $65 billion is on top of a $10 billion amount being distributed by the U.S. Treasury based on the American Rescue Plan. Treasury also oversees about $350 billion in funding for COVID relief to eligible states, local governments, etc., part of which could be used for broadband. According to the Government Accountability Office, there are over 100 federal programs overseen by 15 different agencies that are using money that could be for, and sometimes specifically is, for broadband development. This vast array of broadband programs raises serious questions. Where's all this money going, and who decides? Are decisions being made to the benefit of taxpayers and customers so they get the biggest bang for their buck? Or are bureaucratic inefficiencies and political favoritism creeping in? States are ultimately responsible for most of the Infrastructure Act money. Well, what should they be doing to ensure efficiency, transparency, and accountability? And how can these government agencies keep from repeating mistakes that have rendered past broadband programs largely ineffective? Here to discuss these issues are four scholars that are providing leadership for AEI's new effective broadband program, which will be grading how well or poorly these programs are doing. With us is Professor Janice Hauge. She's Director of Graduate Admissions in Economics at the University of North Texas. She has extensive research in industrial organization, regulation, telecommunications, and broadband policy. She's a senior fellow with the Alexander Hamilton Institute and serves on the board of directors of the Telecommunications Policy Research Conference. Also with us is Professor Jim Prager of Pepperdine University. He's an economist specializing in regulatory economics, industrial organization, and applied econometrics. He's written extensively on broadband deployment and the digital divide. He's on the advisory boards of several top-level academic journals, and from 2008 to 2009, he served as a senior economist with the FCC. We also have Professor Greg Roston of Stanford University. Greg is the Gordon Kane Senior Fellow with the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research and Director of the Public Policy Program. He served as Deputy Chief Economist at the FCC in the 1990s, and in 2011 was Senior Economist for the FCC on the proposed AT&T T-Mobile transaction. Then we have Dr. Scott Walston. He's President and Senior Fellow at the Technology Policy Institute and also a Senior Fellow at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. He was the Economics Director for the FCC's National Broadband Plan, was a Senior Fellow at the AEI Brookings Joint Center for Regulatory Studies, a resident scholar at AEI, an economist at the World Bank, and a staff economist for the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Also on our advisory team, but unable to join us, is Professor Michelle Connolly of Duke University. We'll be providing video interviews with Michelle and other members of the team at later dates. So Jim, Janice, Greg, and Scott, welcome. I have a few questions for each of you, but around 2:10, we'll open the floor for questions from our audience. If members of our audience would like to ask questions, please email them to jake.easter@aei.org. Again, that's Jake, J-A-K-E, Easter, just like the holiday, E-A-S-T-E-R, @aei.org. Or you can tweet them to us using hashtag AskAEITech. Again, that is hashtag AskAEITech. So Scott, let me begin with you. Could you please give us a brief overview of what's happening at NTIA, at Treasury, and elsewhere, and how you think things are going?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me here. So let me start off by saying that, with all of these there are so many programs that it's a huge task, complicated task to coordinate them all, make sure they're not overlapping. And also that many of the agencies assigned to give out the grants are not grant making agencies inherently. So Treasury is giving out $10 billion. Treasury is not traditionally a grant making agency. NTIA is giving out 40 some billion. They also are not a traditional grant making agency. There's not a criticism of them because Congress told them to do it. So lots of people at all these places are working hard to try to figure this out. And I fully believe everyone's trying to do the best job they can. So that's just to preface it. We can't expect perfection, and some failures don't necessarily mean program failures. So I want to be clear that I know they've got a tough job, and I respect the work they're doing. But where we are right now, so the FCC recently released what they're calling its funding map, which shows subsidies distributed so far. Now, it looks to me like it's not quite complete because it doesn't seem to show a lot of money on it. But that's important because we don't want the subsidies from other programs to overlap with money that's already going out. So this is going to be an important part of the coordination. And the FCC also now should have completed the availability map from which the allocations to states will be divided up. And states get money based on the share of the unserved population of the country that is in that state, or unserved locations, I should say, not population necessarily. And so we'll know that next week, although we have a pretty good idea of it anyway, because the FCC has done a good job of continuing to update the map, and we know what it says. Once that happens, states have, I believe, 180 days to get NTIA their plans for how they distribute the money. And this is where, where the rubber will hit the road, because this is when states have to decide how are they going to give out this money. And that's going to make a huge difference. They could give it out in ways that it's completely wasted. They could give it out in ways that it's very cost effective, and it potentially even have money left over to do other things. It allows them to use it for things other than just infrastructure if they cover their unserved areas. And we could talk a little bit more about this later. But I think states have two levers that they can use once they have these their allocations. One is like I said, how they distribute the money. And many of us here have written about the benefits of using reverse auctions, how far that can stretch dollars. We can talk about that later. And the other is something that they're working on now, which is where to set this, what's called the extremely high cost threshold. And below that threshold, the estimated cost of providing an area, they have a very strong preference for fiber. It's built into the law, it's built into the notice of funding opportunities. But above that threshold, they can be much more technologically neutral, which is the way I think it always should be. And so that makes a difference. That will also make a difference in how much the states have to spend on service, where they set that threshold. Now, the advocates of fiber are going to want it to be set very high, and advocates of other technologies will want it to be set lower. But they'll have to make that decision, and they're going through that now. So that's where they are. And Treasury is also announcing where the money is going. The amount to states is done by formula. Treasury is not deciding how much each state should get. But I believe they could be much more transparent about the grants and how the decisions are made for what types of programs get funded. And so far, we haven't seen much of that.
Okay, so there's a lot going on, a lot of moving parts, a lot of people who had full-time jobs doing something else now trying to sort through this and make this work well.
I should add one more thing, actually, but
ahead,
just before I go on, in terms of the people power needed for this, it's not just the people at NTIA and Treasury and the FCC all trying to do something new. It's that each of the states has to. They've never had this kind of money to give out before, and so they've had to build up or are building up capacity to do it. And that people sometimes think that allocating money, that's it, you've given the resources. Money isn't resources. We can talk about those, other issues like the Buy America problems, but labor is an issue too, in terms of the expertise needed to do this, let alone the labor needed to install the networks later.
All right, very good. Just one other thing I would add in terms of you're pulling in people. I helped the state of Florida write its earlier strategic plan on broadband. A lot of emphasis there and in what NTIA is doing on getting local governments involved in this, other just local community people. This is a huge effort for a lot of different types of work. And I should say to the rest of the panelists, if there's anything you want to add on any question, please let me know, chime in and do so. I'll manage the time as best we need to. So Greg, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just one of the things from as far as I can tell, it's unclear how the states are going to decide on how they're giving out the money. And that's pretty important to understand. Scott said somewhat flippantly, but pretty clearly, they could waste a lot of the money. And by not picking away, I think the law says they have to have competitive process, but it doesn't specify what that competitive process is or how it would work. And as far as I have not read about any state that has sort of articulated what it intends to do. And seems to me that it might be good for NTIA to set up a framework that says, hey, this is what you can do. And if you do this, we'll approve it.
Okay, so Scott, we'll return to that issue in a little bit. But in terms of this wasting money versus getting a lot of bang for your buck, let me turn to Jim. Jim, you've done a lot of research on a program that's about 15 years ago called BTOP, another grant program run by the NTIA, and you looked at its effectiveness. So what kinds of things did you learn?
Right, thank you. And also thank you for inviting me to this panel. To my West Coast colleagues, good morning. To others, good afternoon. So we, of course, have walked at least a little bit down this road before of large-scale federally run and administered programs. Probably a lot of people listening are familiar with BTOP. Let me just say a little bit about it to refresh your memory, because this dates back to the time after the Great Recession, 2009. So Broadband Technological Opportunity Program, I believe is the acronym, came out of ARA. And it wasn't administered by NTIA. It was a lot of money at the time, laughably small by current standards, but $5 billion. And its goal, of course, was to increase broadband access and adoption rates among populations that were underrepresented in that respect, particular emphasis on minority and low-income households. So the question always comes, or should come, of what do you get for your money? First, let me note that even though this is over a decade ago, I could only find 3 papers. Of course, there's a lot of research on this, but I'm just speaking about papers that do quantitative evaluations that are kind of up to snuff with current methods in econometrics and other fields. I did have the fortune to work with Janice Hauge, another of our panelists here, on one of them. And we have a paper that was the first paper that looked at this. It was, we were examining, okay, so we spent all this money. What did we get for it if we look at fixed residential broadband connections per 100 households? And we looked across the entire nation. And we had, as our policy variable, we were looking at the BTOP funding per household in the county. And just briefly, just the 3 main points that we found. First, to its credit, the money did appear to be going where it was intended to go. So counties with more minorities and low-income households in them did get more money. So far, so good. The other 2 conclusions, not so good. So after controlling for just the background trends, because of course, broadband is just diffusing over time, even in the absence of policy. So after controlling for that, we didn't find any residual positive effect really at all on getting more residential broadband connections. And I would also just say the third thing that we found is that, let me put it this way, use some econ jargon. The NTIA basically demonstrated through revealed preference, in other words, looking at its choices, that it was not interested at all in true policy evaluation here. They funded neither our study nor the other 2 that I'm going to talk about. And it also showed that it wasn't interested because it didn't require recipients of the money to do any of this. They had a very bureaucratic mentality, show us that you didn't do waste, fraud, and abuse sort of evaluation, but not did we actually do anything to increase broadband? Let me just briefly mention 2 other studies. There's another one by Beard, Ford, and Stern that just came out last year. They did something somewhat similar to our investigation and came to a very similar conclusion: no effect of the spending on residential broadband adoption in the home. And then there was a third paper, came out 2 years ago, that was a little bit different. It looked at the impact of support for public computing centers. So for example, libraries received money to set up these PCCs, and they looked for spillover effects to residential broadband, which I kind of look at that research program and say, well, why would there be any? But they used good quality methods and found that there weren't any. So, okay. I'll stop there for now, but I will just note that I don't know how many $5 billion government programs there are that have so little study attached to them. I think that's something to keep in mind as we talk about what AEI is trying to do here with our broadband tracker.
Could I jump in for a second?
Yes.
Just one thing to emphasize what Jim said. That was a $5 billion program. Treasury's program now is twice that size. And NTIA's program is so big that even the allowed administrative expenses are about the size of BTOP. And so, given the huge magnitude of this, meaning the potential opportunities and potential waste, the evaluation, what Jim is talking about is even more important this time.
Just to reiterate that, as you and I and others, we've all talked to people involved, and everyone understands this is a lot of money that's involved. We just weren't effective before. It'd be a horrible shame to waste $75+ billion, the taxpayers not getting their money's worth. So big part of our purpose here and with our program, our project, is to try and help this be more effective this time. Because everybody's interested in being effective. Everybody wants to be. But there are things that get in the way, and that's what we want to emphasize and learn about here. So go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, just one thing. I think right now basically all the states are planning on evaluating things, but they're going to be 51 or something different evaluation metrics. And in a lot of evaluations, what you want to do is set out in advance what your metrics are. In a lot of randomized controlled trials and other things, you have to register what your plan is in advance of doing the study. I fear that a lot of these people that are getting hired to do these evaluations are going to come back and say, yeah, they did a good job. Here's how we measured it. And you're going to have 51 different ways of measuring it, because they're going to tailor it to making sure that the state that hired them is looking good. And I think this is something that would be really important to try to have a more comprehensive evaluation metric that spans a lot of states. Maybe there's some difference between rural and urban states, but those should be set out in advance as to what we want to get for the money. And evaluations are critical to trying to figure out how we're doing and what's going to happen the next time we try to have an infrastructure plan for whatever it is.
Yeah, I saw a program back 15 or so years ago. The federal government was spending a lot of money on, it wasn't on broadband, it's on something else. It wanted to have an evaluation, so it funded Virginia Tech, not a shabby university, to gather the data and analyze it, and they could not. The data just either were missing or measured in many different ways, and so couldn't. So Janice, when we talk about the rubric, which we will in just a little bit, please be sure to bring up about the emphasis on comparable metrics across the programs and states. But before we go there, Greg, let me come back to you. Several things that we see in what the FCC is doing, what NTIA is doing, relate to ensuring that broadband is affordable. Now, you and Scott have researched how low-income customers respond to be given different kinds of price discounts. What kind of lessons have you learned?
First, I also want to thank you for all the work you've done organizing this project and this panel. And second, I want to make it clear that Jim and I are in different places. We both have palm trees and arches and stucco walls behind us. Mine's at night and his is during the day, but they were at different places. So when I teach economic policy analysis, I tell my students there are 3 questions you should think about for any policy evaluation you're doing. First is it a big number or small number? That's kind of what you want to know. And by the way, the numbers that you started out with, Mark, these are big numbers we're talking about. So this is, these billions of dollars are big numbers. Second question is compared to what? What's your opportunity cost? Different approaches of what might work and the opportunity cost in economic terms. The third is what you're really asking about here, is what's the elasticity? I tell my students, ask what's the elasticity? How responsive is a behavior to a policy or policy change? In this case, we want to think about how responsive consumers are to price. What are they going to do? So historically, telecom and particularly telephone service has been shown to be incredibly price inelastic. That means that people are generally insensitive to price. They subscribe, and if you change the price, it doesn't change subscription a whole lot. So with several co-authors, I did a paper in 2012 where we found that was true, but that low-income households were 3 times more sensitive to price than high-income households. But they were still very insensitive to price, even low-income households. So that's a long-winded wind-up for talking about the work that Scott and I did in our 2020 paper, where we looked at the effects of a private low-income broadband program. So Comcast implemented a program called Internet Essentials in 2011 as part of their Comcast NBCU merger. Because there was no other company that did so in a meaningful way before 2015, we were able to use the data from 2010 and 2015, before and after the implementation of Internet Essentials, to examine the effect that Comcast service, the effects in Comcast service territories compared to other broadband providers. Because, as Jim said, there's been this increase of broadband overall. We wanted to separate out the effects of the Internet Essentials program from the overall increase. And so we used this difference in difference analysis and showed that the program Internet Essentials got a lot of low-income people online. That was, as maybe I should follow Jim's lead of, that's the good news. There are two important points. First, there was a large price decrease from the regular retail price. We just sort of use something close to $30 as the regular retail price. Most of the people watching here, I bet, are paying more than $30 a month for their broadband, down to $9.95 a month. That's a big price decrease. So even with a low elasticity, you're going to get a lot of people online. But not nearly everyone got online. There were still a large number of people, even in Comcast territories with $9.95 a month, that didn't get online. Second, as an economist, there's a large income transfer to people who would have subscribed anyway. So such a transfer might be good, but it's not the goal of the program, and it's likely an inefficient way to transfer money. So I want to kind of go now to what we're thinking about. Right now, there's an affordable connectivity program, ACP, that provides up to $30 a month as a subsidy for qualifying low-income households. And a lot of people are signing up. That's the good news. The more that sign up, though, there's a fixed pot of money right now. So the more that sign up, the quicker the money is going to run out. So Congress is going to be faced with a decision sometime in the next year, probably, if they raise the debt ceiling. Maybe they won't get to that quickly, as to how it might extend and fund the ACP. So with an effective price of $0, not only for the $9.95 a month plan, but Comcast and others were smart, and they said, wow, they're giving $30. Let's get a plan that charges $30 as opposed to $9.95 a month, and we can get $30 for it. So more people are getting online with a price of going from $9.95 to $0. But again, I suspect not everyone's going to get online. Why? I think there are lots of reasons. I recently had an op-ed published talking about the ACP, and I actually got one email comment back. Luckily, only one. And actually, it was a very nice comment. And she said, one reason that I hadn't mentioned was that people like her were scared of the internet and needed more training. I did thank her for her response, and I did resist pointing out the irony that she'd read the piece online and had emailed me. So this is, we still don't know how and why people with a price of $0 aren't going online and whether they should be. She mentioned digital literacy training as we should do this. This is, in my mind, this is like mom and apple pie. This is great stuff. But how does it work? Does it work? We don't know. do some experiments. Scott has a paper where he found that people were willing to pay not to do digital literacy training because it got an opportunity cost of time. But we should try and test and see what kinds of things are available and help people get online so they can access services like scheduling a COVID shot or other things like that. So low-income people are, they will get online if the price a lot of them will get online. They have low incomes and they're getting online a lot more because of the ACP, but not everyone will. But we need to think about funding the ACP more and understanding other training and things like that.
All right, thank you, Greg. Anyone else want to chime in on this?
I'll add just a couple of
Sure.
things. One is, in terms of getting more people online, it's even harder, we think, for a public program to do it than for a private program like Comcast's, because part of one condition for participating in Comcast's program was that you not have had at least Comcast broadband in the past, or in the past some number of months. So they were targeting explicitly the margin, as we call it, the people who don't have it. And so, we think we estimated about half of the people who signed up were actually brand new, which is for a program is really, really good. But you can imagine the blowback when a public program tries to do that says only certain types of low-income people can apply. In fact, Comcast got criticized for this, even though it's exactly what you want to do if you want to target the margin. But the political economy of it makes it all the more difficult for a public program. So it's just a challenge, another challenge to overcome.
All right, thank you. So Janice, you've been very patient. Let me turn to you with the question. And I'm going to pivot from talking about what have we learned to what should people be trying as we move into the future. But before I do that, I want to point out two things that I'll just ask people to go and look up on work that you've done. One is in your research on BTOP, you did research on the political economy of it and found that there was a lot of political interference on how the money was distributed, and that probably led to its inefficiency. So I'd encourage people to go look at that. Then also, you've done the most extensive literature review, looking at all the studies. What have we learned from all the broadband studies out there? And I'd encourage people to look at that as well. If they want to, they'll find it as part of Florida's strategic broadband plan. So if you Google Florida strategic broadband plan, look at Appendix F. That's Janice's literature review. It's the best that I've seen. She did a really, really good job for that. But now let me turn towards the future. As I said earlier, you've been the primary author of our rubric, how we will put grades on what we see different entities doing. Please give us an overview of that rubric. What's in it? What should people understand about it?
Thank you, Mark. So the goal with the Broadband Grade Card Initiative and the associated rubric that we've developed is to identify and quantify the elements of broadband access and adoption programs that are funded under the Biden administration's Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program. So that's the program that we know as BEAD, $42 billion program. The rubric we've created includes elements or characteristics of policies that our prior research among most of us has found either to benefit or to hinder the success of broadband access and adoption programs. So within the rubric and our evaluation of programs that are seeking funding, we measure success quantitatively in terms of producing a positive outcome from the projects that are undertaken. So not necessarily only implementation of a project, but what are the outcomes from use of that funding? So the rubric has three elements or three facets to it: efficiency, transparency, and accountability. And we measure each of these throughout the funding process and subsequent project implementation. With respect to efficiency, states should have clearly defined goals and objectives. So specifying precisely what they want. And then there should be processes by which applicants compete on the amount of money they would need to meet the goals. So there would be competition for the funding. And then markets would work to determine prices and services that are appropriate for that given area and the project. So efficiency measures include, for example, the proposed project's cost of deployment per new household connected, and the speed of deployment, which also addresses the technology that's used, as several of our panelists mentioned earlier. The rubric includes information available on each state's broadband office website. So these new people who have been tasked with distributing this money have created broadband offices by state, and we're seeking the information that's on that website and available for the public to see during the planning stages, the granting period stages, and then the deployment period, so that we can have a measure of transparency. So, for example, we are able to note whether a website provides specific objective criteria for evaluating proposals at this stage, and whether it's clear which households are classified as unserved or underserved. We look at whether grants are awarded based on an effective and transparent competitive process, whether any specific labor restrictions exist. We expect that grant recipients should be easily identified, with the total dollars awarded, including any matching funds from other sources. The technology chosen should be listed. The number of households in the grant area as a proportion of the number of unserved and underserved households in that grant area should be given. So these measures of transparency are important in really developing and engendering trust among both the participants and the taxpayers. And then the third facet is accountability. So accountability will include quantitative information on the current status of projects. For example, the total number of households passed at the beginning of the grant funding versus 6 months later. So we would hope to find an accounting of the total BEAD dollars spent and total dollars from other sources that were spent. So if we get this three-faceted analysis of efficiency, transparency, and accountability, we'll be able to offer information on the impact of the BEAD program by state. But more importantly, instead of looking back at it and trying to evaluate, was this effective or was it not? Have we wasted the money or have we not? We'll be able to offer information up front on what can be done to improve efficiency and to help hold fund recipients accountable and to provide transparency. And so when we put all these metrics together, the product is a quarterly updated broadband grade card for each state. And the goal of producing this rubric and the associated grade card is that this knowledge together will help states to ensure that their current efforts are successful in bringing broadband to people who lack broadband entirely or lack broadband of sufficient capacity to carry out business or education or civic functions, or lack broadband ability. So the rubric includes best practices that states can use to help manage this complicated process that they've all been given, and we'll have links to available data and information. And together, this initiative should enable communication among states so that they can look at what has worked and what have they tried and what are they doing and how might that work in my state, so that this massive BEAD program might hopefully result in more positive outcomes than we've found to be true of similar programs in the past.
All right, thank you, Janice. Those three parts are really important. I just want to emphasize them. That first one on efficiency, in a little bit, I'm going to ask Jim to talk about, after people receive the funding, kind of how does the market play out and what kinds of rules actually help that work well and maybe not. We'll also talk about what are the rules for people to get funding in the first place, because that can be done very well or very poorly. I'll ask Scott to be talking about that. Transparency, so that legislators, people in Congress, citizens, everybody can see what's going on. That helps hold the funders accountable, and it helps people analyze and compare. Scott, if we have time, I know you've done a lot of work in that area. I'll ask you about that, but I'm not sure if we'll have time. If I can, I will. And then this last thing of accountability, and that is if someone doesn't perform, we heard Jim talk about earlier about what was NTIA back in the old days excited about? Well, not about making sure that people are getting bang for their buck. How do we hold people accountable? Back when Scott was an economist with the World Bank, they had launched a program called was that output-based aid, which was, yes, we'll subsidize what's going on in the country after you've performed, and not just give you money, then say, go forth and do good, and we'll hope that it goes well. They changed that, and that's part of what we'd like to see here as well. So thank you for explaining the rubric. So Jim, now let me turn to you. One of the areas that Janice was talking about is this efficiency. And you've done research on how it is that regulating prices in an otherwise competitive market, how that performs or doesn't perform. You've actually researched as well, what if government requires someone to open their network for rivals? So the government's involved in how a network actually functions. I won't go into what those cases were that you researched, but you're one of the few people that's actually done all of that. And I was wondering if what you would say are the things you've learned that would be good advice for the states as they think about what they would do in terms of pricing and in terms of opening networks.
Right. And I should say I've done a little research in this area, but we actually have a lot of good research that's been done on these topics in economics, both theoretical modeling, kind of highlighting how things might work, but also a lot of empirical work, just comparing different types of regulatory approaches to greater competition, less competition, price regulation, access requirements. So we actually know quite a bit about this. And without talking too much about any specific regulatory regime or option, I just wanted to highlight some of the big points from that literature. So one of the things that one could think of doing is saying, okay, if we as a state are going to give you money, then you have to do X, Y, and Z as a condition of getting this money. And even before talking about what X, Y, and Z might be, just note that is not without potential consequence. So for example, we know that when, for example, incumbents are forced to open or required to open their networks to others to do, for example, competing ISPs can come in and use the network and do what's called euphemistically service competition, which means they didn't actually invest anything to bring anything new to the market. Instead of true facilities-based competition, we know from a lot of literature, particularly based in the European experience, that might have some short-run benefits and might look good on paper if you have a really short-term perspective to encourage, quote, competition. And perhaps prices, but in the longer run, it is to the detriment of investment. So the real theme here is every good intention that you might have to try to give consumers a better deal or more access, to the extent that it hurts the revenue or profit that can be made from the network, you've just reduced that provider's incentive to build the network. And maybe we don't worry about that here, because if they get the money, they have to build it, but also to maintain and extend it. It is not out of the range of thinking that some of these networks might disappear once the money disappears if they come with too many strings attached. So let me just mention a couple other things here. So there's less incentive to invest in the network by the owner of the network, but there is also, for example, if you have some sort of price requirement, or you've made service-based competition an easy route to enter the market without investing, that also harms the incentives of potential future entrants as well. These are also likely to be high-cost areas in many cases. That's why they need support. And so coupling state and federal money with a requirement to charge a particular price, we should be particularly sensitive to that, because you're basically saying, okay, we're giving money to you because you can't make profit running or operating or opening a network without this support. We're going to give you money, but then we're also going to make sure that you can never make enough revenue to cover your ongoing costs. that has long-term implications. Without investment in the network, you're going to have more congestion, lower quality of service. The things that consumers like, they won't be getting necessarily anyway. Let me just mention one other thing, and I don't know what to do with this. So I'm going to raise the issue and then open it up to the smarter people on the panel. So regarding price regulation or price requirements, so we do have this so-called middle class affordability plan mandated by NTIA. And so every state has to wrestle with what to do about that. So the NTIA, as I understand it, didn't say you have to do exactly this or that, but they did provide some options, things like price regulation. And it's hard even to discuss it because it's vague and probably unnecessary as well. Let me just mention a few points here. So the goal is this vague, affordability, and even more vague, affordable for the middle class. So we could debate who's middle class till the end of this session, but just focus on affordable. First of all, the way an economist thinks about affordable is probably not the way policymakers think about it. For example, George Ford has some work showing that, yeah, for the middle class, broadband is affordable if we take that word as it actually means, not what we might want it to mean. I'd also say we can't just tell providers that they have to offer low cost, high speed, high quality plans. You can't just put out a bunch of specifications that would be impossible to meet that just ignore economic reality. So this is a hard question. The other thing I would say is I don't think we really want to go back to the bad old days of all the hidden subsidies and using prices to do transfers and cross-subsidize. And, some of the state regulators listening, if they're old enough like me, they might remember things like dial equipment minutes and long-term support plans. I mean, there are all sorts of hidden subsidies that, to its credit, the FCC and Congress got rid of in the Telecom Act back in the 90s. I don't think we want to use prices to do that. And I would just say, my policy prescription is a more general one, perhaps, than just the broadband regulator in the state or the utility regulator. But I think the best thing to do, if you feel the need to subsidize something, don't try to do it through some weird way through prices or price requirements, I should say. Just, raise the funds through taxing your citizens in the sunshine of public debate and opinion, and see what the voters are willing to support. I think that's a more honest and certainly more economically efficient way to go than to just try to jigger things around with hidden requirements.
All right, thank you. Anyone else want to chime in on this?
Actually, I think the pricing question is even more complicated than Jim is making it, because they have this completely amorphous middle class affordability requirement in there. But these networks are inherently in high cost areas. But then again, on the flip side, they will also inherently be probably the own provider there, except for satellite, which means that maybe you do want to think somehow about their prices, right? But then again, I don't know how many hands we have, we need an octopus. But I'm concerned that in a few years, these networks are going to turn around and say, hey, we're not profitable. We don't have enough money for OpEx. We need more subsidies. And so the end result of us spending $100 billion is going to be expanding our already $8 billion annual universal service fund by a whole lot more as these companies come hat in hand to their senators demanding more money to stay operational. And I think states would need to take that into account, and maybe even make it part of the bidding process somehow. What's the long-term business plan? Not that those always work out, of course.
So
Greg?
I agree with what you said, Scott, but I think, states may not want to take that into account because they may figure that it's, federal universal service support that will get them, and this is their money right now. So they think of it, there's a jurisdictional difference. So I agree that operators will think we need to get enough money to build it and be long-term profitable, and as much money as we can get out of people and the government together is what we're going to bid based on and think about. as a, the middle class affordability is kind of an interesting, it's as we said, a vague concept and unclear what that means, unclear what middle class means, unclear what affordable means. But one thing to think about is the cost structure of a network is that it's high fixed costs to build the network and then relatively lower marginal costs to operate it. We have this other thing that I don't understand what it means, which is middle mile, that they have to pay for to get stuff there. And it's, I'm sure that Janice has comments about middle mile stuff in the BTOP program and other things. But companies that operate a network are going to, if you've put up a lot of fixed costs, you want to get more customers online, because the only way you're going to get money from customers or the government is by having people online. And so almost, the incentive is to make it somehow affordable for middle class people as well, by, even though Scott's right, there may be a monopoly. So I worry about those things.
All right, well, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I just, while we were talking here, it came up earlier in today's conversation that possible reverse auctions could be used to allocate money. I will point people, there is a long-standing older literature back when we called it telecom, of telecom regulation. For example, in Kenneth Train's book called Optimal Regulation, that would be a good resource for anyone interested. There is this notion of auctioning the franchise, which was originally kind of a thought experiment for how to best allocate. If you're going to have a monopoly cable provider, in a city, how should that franchise be awarded to a firm? Well, one of the things you can do, it's kind of like a reverse auction. You can have people also, firms bid on service attributes as well. And in the specific context of prices, it's shown that under the very plausible situation where the regulators have less information about costs than the firms, that have bidding down the service price that will be committed to charge for service, or in this case, I suppose it could be a price for a middle class affordability plan, can actually lead to some efficient results. So that might be, there are details to be worked out. And of course, having a double reverse auction would, double bidding on both, the lump sum up front plus other service attributes could create other complications, but it is something to think about. Anytime there's a situation where an economist says, okay, this party knows more than this other party, but it's the other party that has to do the work, we think auctions, a demand revelation mechanism.
Yeah, so Scott, I'm going to turn to you for that in just a minute, because you and your organization have done some of the best work on that particular type of an issue. I just want to wrap up this pricing discussion of how are we and opening networks, this discussion of what do we do in an otherwise competitive market. I was a telecommunications regulator back when we were transitioning competition. So was Greg. And I always remember the advice that Alfred Kahn used to give us. And Alfred Kahn is one of these people that died way too young. He was about 90 years old when he died, but we could still use him today if he were around. Because one of the things that he really emphasized to us was that you can either have regulation of how prices are set and how services are provided, or you can have competition. You can't have both, and you will not have both. If you step into one, the other one has to be let go. And I thought it was really good advice. A little tough to take for somebody whose job was to do the regulation, but on our experiences and the research, he was right. So Scott, let's now turn to you. Like I said, you've done really good work on how the funding is done, how the choices are made. Specifically, one of your economists, Sarah O, estimated that you could save 50% with a good auction type process versus a grant type process. So if a state had $10 million to spend, if they ran a grant process, they might get up to $10 million worth of broadband. But if they had this auction process, they could get maybe $20 million worth of broadband for that 10. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. So Scott, why don't you tell us how we should understand this? What's your advice?
Yeah, so Sarah's work on BTOP, where she found basically that the effectiveness, the outcomes the programs they chose were no more effective than if they had just thrown the applications down the stairs and picked up, a random bunch of them. And they could have, doubled the effectiveness by picking the most expected cost-effective projects first. And so we want to make sure that that happens. And we've talked a little bit about this already. And states do have to do a competitive process, but there's no definition of what a competitive process is. I mean, a competitive process could be, the first one who runs to the governor and gives him a bribe. You won that contest, you were first. But that's not what we wanted. I'm not accusing anybody of anything. But in these reverse auctions, you get companies to compete and you bid down the amount that's required to fund an area. And so, for example, if you look at RDOF, this reverse auction that we had a while ago, which has become controversial for reasons I'll discuss in a second, you look at the reserve prices that the FCC set for each location, and those are based on cost models. So that was the most they were willing to pay. That's where they started the auction, and then the amounts would lower. On average, even for fiber builds, the winning bids were about half of what the cost models estimated. So that shows just how much money you can, how much further you can stretch that dollar if you do that right. Now, people criticized RDOF because there were some odd results. This one wireless company, LTD, that one was the biggest winner, and nobody's really sure that they can actually do what they promised. That's an eligibility issue, which would have affected any mechanism they'd use. So, you want to get the eligibility criteria right, that's for sure. But that's why it's so important to get this right. Because, imagine if there's a way that you could get twice as much money as you're being given. That's the way to do it. And the other thing to think about, maybe two other points. We've also talked about evaluation and the need to do it. And also the need to think about it before the fact. And that doesn't just mean deciding what metrics to collect. It means thinking about how you're going to do the evaluation. You need something to compare the outcome to. So usually an evaluation comes in and says, look, we spent this much money and we got this many people connected. What a great program. But you don't know that money was responsible necessarily for those connections. They might have been connected anyway. Or you might have been able to connect them for a lot less money. So you need to think about how to do that in advance. Now, I mean, it's kind of hard to think of what your control group might be, but it's not impossible. And also, when you think about the cost of doing evaluations compared to the amount of money that's being spent, it's nothing. You could fund every economics and political science master's student in every state to do an evaluation, and it still wouldn't be a rounding error in this money. Help the universities and colleges in your states, make that a program for them to do some evaluations. So there are lots of ways to do this. They shouldn't ignore it, and there's no reason to ignore it because they are not cash constrained, and it would just be a travesty if all they did was their standard thing of this is what we spent and this is what we got, because that's not an evaluation. Now, the other thing that's sort of related is on the data question and mapping. I think people have a tendency to think of the broadband maps as pictures and truth. That if we just get the right map with all the dots filled out, we'll just know everything. And so this, I think, has two problems. One is that the map is a visualization of the data, and lots of information can go into it. The second is that there's measurement error. There always will be in every single data set. And so for the most part, we don't, when you're talking about hundreds of millions of locations, you never know for sure what kind of connectivity a location can have. I mean, you can be pretty sure in certain areas, it's all fiber, brand new houses. Yeah, you can be pretty sure they've probably got a fiber connection. But maybe there's an old house in the middle of a fiber area that doesn't have the right wiring inside. So the point is, you just know these things with probabilities. And to get that right, you can bring in other types of data that's not availability to check, to see how accurate is the information that you have. And so we did a blog post recently where we used data on adoption and speed test data to kind of do a cross-check on adoption. On availability. And you can imagine a Venn diagram. And you decide what each one means for sort of high levels of connectivity. Where they all intersect, you can be pretty sure, yeah, the availability information is probably right there. If you find an availability where availability says one thing and the adoption and speed test data say completely another, maybe then you have a problem with your information. And then you can focus efforts on updating that information. So once you start thinking about it as data and stop thinking about it as pictures, there's a whole lot you can do with a lot of information that is already even available for free. So the analytical side of this, I think, is really important. And once states actually have to kind of give out the money and start thinking specifically, what questions exactly do we need to answer, then they can start thinking about, exactly what data do we need, and it becomes more sophisticated. They can make better recommendations and have better programs as a result.
So let me ask you a little bit more on that, Scott. So I talk with a lot of regulators around the world about their different processes for issuing licenses, and qualification, who can actually do the work, is always a really tough decision. So I'd like for you to give your advice on how do you know who can actually do the work? And then I'd also like you to give advice on how would you, as a practical matter, actually run a reverse auction, because auctions are complicated as heck. And the FCC is world class in this. Nobody's better than the FCC, but Congress didn't include them in this. So what are your thoughts?
Right. So first, on eligibility, you're right. I mean, it's not easy, because again, you're talking about trying to predict the future and who will be able to do something. So you have to rely on the past track record. But on the other hand, you also do want to encourage new entrants, right? You want new firms to participate. And Greg and I have written a little bit about this and how you could incorporate something like this into the auction. So say that somebody has a technology that's not really fully tried out yet, but you want them to participate because they may actually be a low cost, very high quality provider. You can change it so that more of the risk falls onto that bidder. So they can't just treat their bid as an option value to get money. They can only get the money, say, if they can demonstrate some build out level. So they have to get capital first. And if they truly believe in their technology, they'll have no trouble obtaining capital when they know that, when they have a guarantee from the government that they'll be repaid as soon as they make this operational. So it puts more of the risk on them. And so that's one way to bring in additional new firms, new entrants, without having to put too much risk on the taxpayer. And of course, that was one of the problems with LTD. The risk really is on the taxpayer. If they can't do it, we just don't get we don't get the build out. But the other is, and then there's a second part of that, though. Once you make the rules, you got to follow them. The FCC decided that SpaceX was not eligible after it had decided it was eligible and after it won nearly $1 billion in the auctions. Now, maybe SpaceX shouldn't have been eligible. I don't know. But the FCC changed their mind after the fact, and it looks like they changed it based on speed test results, which they have said in other instances aren't admissible as evidence for things. So it's all just a confused mess. And so you've got to make sure that you're good for your promises. That's for sure. I mean, maybe Greg has thoughts on eligibility and also designing an auction. I mean, tell you, if you're going to design the auction, well, one thing, I think you'd want NTIA to have NTIA help organize organize how one would do this auction, or the FCC also. They should work together, because the FCC is the one who knows how to do this. But you definitely don't want 50 states and all the territories each struggling to organize their own. That would be a silly waste of resources. But Greg, you must have thoughts on this.
Well, that last point was one I was going to make. There's nothing in the, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to make this up, but there's nothing that's preventing NTIA from saying, hey, FCC, help the states. Use make your software and rules available, or even offer, we'll pay you to run it for the states. They can, the FCC has the expertise, as you said, Mark, and they know how to do this, and they've done it. They did it. There were two problems with the RDOF auction that were basically procurement problems that would occur anywhere. So I think avoiding those is important. But then you run an auction. It's a competitive process, and that's what the law says. Make it easy for states to run a competitive process. And taking that a step back to what you said earlier, Mark, Scott said it's you get twice as much money, or the auctions cut the number in half. And Mark, you said something about private markets. Well, we often underestimate the ability of firms to do things. It's not just in the RDOF auction that we saw these prices go down by so much, but it's also like in permits for pollution permits. Everyone thinks those prices are going to be extremely high, and around the world they've been much lower than the reserve prices. And people are panicked. They're saying the auction prices are too low. Well, that's because firms respond to the incentives and do things efficiently. And government has historically, not only it's not necessarily that they're bad. All the regulators want to do the right thing. Absolutely convinced of that. They don't have the information and the incentives. And I think it's right that the firms have an information asymmetry where they have information about what it would cost, and they know what they're willing to do. And we should take advantage of that by harnessing the power of the market to reduce the cost of these programs so that we can use the money for something else.
All right, Janice. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say, for state regulatory officials that feel like eligibility is something that they have not done much with in the past, just a suggestion is to talk with other state agencies or departments or whatever that does more contracting, right? Because your state undoubtedly has eligibility requirements for state contracts of some form. And so it could be just a little bit of, learning from what your state already knows, just perhaps not in your agency yet.
Yeah. So Janice, in a moment, I'm going to ask you, what is it that a legislator, a person of Congress should be looking for in the work that we do that helps them in the work that they have to do? Before I do that, though, just to emphasize what Jim was just saying, if you look at the Florida broadband plan, not to put Florida on a pedestal or anything, but it's the one I'm most familiar with. It actually looks to the state's policies and rules and stuff on contracting and says, here's what we're going to follow. And so that's a good point, that you've been down this road before, at least other people have been, and so that you can follow that. And to also say that this challenge of qualifying people, you don't avoid it if you avoid an auction. You still have to do it, regardless of what your process is. So Janice, let me ask you, we have a few minutes before I turn to the audience for their questions. If I'm a legislator, or if I'm Senator so-and-so, what's your advice to me on how I can know whether my taxpayers' money is being spent well and they're getting what they should be getting?
So, well, obviously, I'm very vested in this particular project, and one of the goals, one of the benefits, has been having this group of the people on the panel and I associated with this project. There's so much knowledge and so much information that can be shared and needs to be disseminated among all the parties that are involved. And I think several of us have pointed out, we believe that those in charge have the best interests at heart and in mind. And it's a matter of putting those into practice. So we need to use the information that we have to be more efficient and effective in managing these funds. We need the results to be different. We know from past programs and research, much of what works and a lot of what doesn't. And that information is available. And we need this information to reach as many people associated with this BEAD funding as possible. And an awareness that we care and that people are looking at this. The goal is not to wait for all the money to be spent and then to go backwards and evaluate it. The goal is to inspire continued diligence and assistance as we go forward with this. So policymakers who have access to these grade cards, we've talked about the idea of the rubric and the grade card in a more global or complete framework at this point. It's very specific. It's extraordinarily specific in what we will attach to this. And that specificity ought to enable people to really see what's happening. There will be clear evidence of the current state of these various initiatives tied with effective practices, right? What we know to be true, as Jim was saying, in theory and in practice, right? And so the broadband mapping, like what's being done by the Technology Policy Institute, that's an excellent resource. There are other places that have evidence. What we're attempting to do is put this all in a place that makes it very easy for them to look at the metrics that are in place, to look at how these programs will be evaluated, and to provide information to policymakers on what they should be looking at, and then where to find that information.
All right, thank you. As I teach around the world for regulators, policymakers, and such, how they define their roles and do their jobs, one of the things that I always encourage the policymakers to think about is to understand is they have set up a system. And if the system isn't performing, the temptation of the policymaker will be to say, well, the dadgum employees are just bad. They're not doing their job. And maybe that's true, but it also could be that the system is screwed up in how it was set up to start with. And so you have to be evaluating yourself. And so in terms of policymakers, when you hold hearings, you have discussions, be sure to shine the light on the decisions you've made and that you're making, as well as on what other people are doing, because that's a really important part of the process. So I have one more question for Greg before I move to the audience. Just to remind the audience that if you have questions, please email them to Jake Easter at aei.org. Again, that's jake.easter@aei.org, or just tweet them and include the hashtag AskAEITech. Again, that's hashtag AskAEITECH. Okay, Greg, one more question before I turn to the audience. We've been talking about the technology choices and preferences that the NTIA has and has expressed. I just want to make sure that we've tied that all together as best we can. And this is something you've given a lot of thought to. It's just, what are your thoughts? How is it the states could best deal with the type of policy, the technology preference that NTIA has?
So NTIA, people don't care how they get broadband, just that they get it and it works. It's not like a shiny car or a pair of designer jeans that you use to show your status. It's a means to an end, to getting online. That's what we care about. The people can get online, they can access government services, they can interact with others. And so they need to have high enough speeds and low enough latency so they have the ability to use this technology. And from an economist perspective, that means technology neutrality. You want performance, you don't want technology. You want somebody to do that. So if a wireless company can provide sufficient speed to be useful, that should be great. And if you think about this, most people's internet speed is drastically reduced within their house because they use Wi-Fi, which is almost assuredly the limiting factor for speed at home. And Scott talked about relying on speed tests. Everybody who does a speed test at home has a big difference between what their delivered speed is to their door and what it is in their living room. I realized yesterday that the Ethernet cable for my computer here in my office had been unhooked since I got this computer 2 years ago. And I'd been using Wi-Fi on my work computer, and I plugged it in, and the difference in speed is dramatic. It's 8 times faster on Ethernet here than it is on Wi-Fi. So I figure I'm going to be 8 times as more productive than I have been. I didn't notice it for 2 years. And at home, it's 24 times faster on Ethernet than it is on my Wi-Fi, despite my computer being 2 feet from the router. So the Wi-Fi makes a big difference. So going back to my second question that I ask my students, tell my students to think about in policy is compared to what? So you can't look at fiber in a vacuum. Well, Scott's going to tell me you can, but that's just an expression. So fiber has a speed advantage in a sense and a capacity advantage. but it's also got a speed disadvantage. Right now, people are using Starlink in places without fiber. Under the plans that is going to serve them, it may take 5 to 10 years to build fiber lines to them. And that's a long time to go without service. That's a big speed disadvantage for fiber in my mind. The second issue with fiber compared to others is it's expensive. In some areas, it may be very expensive to get a fiber service, and terrestrial, wireless, or satellite may be an order of magnitude cheaper. And you can use that money. It's got an opportunity cost. It can be used to subsidize many people who are going to be left behind with bills they can't afford when or if the ACP expires. So to me, the bottom line is not what some people like to say, that fiber is future-proof, but that you get service to people that they can use. And that means quality, cost, and time to service. And the states need to think about where they should draw the line between extra high cost and and whether fiber is really the be all end all of things.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. Let me now turn to the audience. And the audience isn't specifying yet who they are wanting to answer which questions. So I'll just throw it out and let someone volunteer. So first question that was asked is, what are some of the efforts underway to attempt to understand why eligible users aren't signing up for the broadband discount programs? I assume they mean the low-income programs. Is this a problem to be solved or managed? Who could be interested in addressing that?
I guess. Go ahead, Scott. I'll let you go.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know of programs right now trying to figure out, trying to think about how to answer this, how to answer this question. We see these surveys over and over again. They always ask the same questions. Why do you not subscribe? And the answer is always a combination of cost and it isn't relevant. And adoption, even among the lowest income, kind of keeps steadily going up, not fast particularly, but it increases. The FCC, the paper you mentioned that I did, the FCC did these experiments like 10 years ago now, where they worked with providers to try all different ways of getting people online, including setting the prices to almost zero across wired and wireline services. And their big finding was that they just couldn't get enough people to sign up to test most of the theories they wanted to test. And it's similar to what Greg was saying before. It's not just price, and it also isn't just digital literacy. Like you said, there was one of the experiments where people were willing to pay $10 to not have to take digital literacy classes because I think the opportunity cost of their time. Lots of poor people work multiple jobs. They don't want to have to spend an hour a week in some class teaching them how to turn on a computer. But at the same time, some digital literacy programs might be really useful. We just nobody's done any work to know what. So I think we need, this doesn't answer what is being done, because I don't know that anyone is actively studying how well these things work, because there just doesn't seem to be any money for it. But we need real research on what types of digital literacy programs work, whether they're effective in getting people online. The things that companies and others and cities and so on are trying now, they call them, I think Comcast calls them digital navigators, maybe I'm mixing up which companies do it, but like local neighborhood people who try to help others get online. Maybe that's a great idea. Maybe it isn't. I don't know. I mean, but like there are these things out there that we should be studying. And I think there's a lot we could learn, but that but there doesn't seem to be an appetite to learn about them.
So
Greg?
Yeah, I was on a panel 2 weeks ago with the head of the Communities and Schools of Los Angeles, Elmer Roldan, and he was talking about they work with kids in schools in Los Angeles, and he was talking about trying to get he was complaining because he had two different kids whose speed was 5 times different in there. And they each paid $65 a month, and they were getting 5 times different speed. I didn't care nearly as much about the 5 times different speed, but the fact that they were paying $65 when Charter actually has a low income program and there's the ACP, and why aren't they getting it? And he said they basically get the runaround when they call, and they haven't figured out how to get to the right people, and it's a hassle, and it's hard to sign up. there's paperwork that they have to do, other things like that. So I think making it easier to sign up, making it a simple simplified. The companies are doing a lot to get people signed up, but it's still, if English isn't your first language, you're kind of not used to, you may not have good credit and you're worried about or you may be an undocumented immigrant. All these things can play into it. So trying to facilitate ways to make this easier that we don't see on a day-to-day basis, maybe things that are having problems for why people don't sign up necessarily.
Actually, let me build on that for a second, because Greg's right. You do hear about difficulties in signing up. I mean, a pretty good percentage of people who are eligible have signed up. Somewhere 30% or so. But one thing to note is that the sign up rate of eligible people for this program is much higher than for Lifeline, which is the our normal low income program. And maybe there's something we can learn about why this one is higher than Lifeline. Maybe it's just because it's more money. But I mean, that'd be a pretty simple answer. So there must be some problems with the ACP sign up, but there must be some things that are right too. And so maybe by comparing these two programs, we might learn something.
Yeah, when we back on the Lifeline, which was about telephone service so many years ago, we did some research on that. Found out, we were asking why people don't sign up. One was, say, this service just doesn't fit my life. That was back when it was a fixed line telephone. Once mobile phones came along, wow, that was amazing. Everybody got them, and then started signing up. And that's maybe a lesson from what Greg was talking about with fiber optics. Maybe that's really not for everyone. Another thing that we learned was that it depends on who's doing the talking. A lot of the low-income households didn't trust us professor types. They didn't trust the government regulators who were asking questions as well. They pretty much trusted people in their community or the government person who they tended to work with, often on their assistance packages, whatever those might be. And so one of the things that Florida did, and this is back when Jeb Bush was governor, is they made this signing up for Lifeline services as part of the signing up for everything else that you'd be getting perhaps from the government. And that really helped people out quite a bit. So lots of different things to try that could be done.
Mark,
go ahead, Jim.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention briefly, I think it's also good to have realistic expectations for sign-up rates for any government program. Right. I mean, so take something like earned income tax credit, free money. 4 out of 5 eligible households get that money. So 1 in 5, for whatever reason, are willing to not take that form of free money. So I mean, you're never going to get anything close to 100%. So the question is, what's an appropriate, what level, as the questioner said, is this a problem to be solved? Mm-hmm. I think that's a good question. I don't know what the answer is, but that's a good way to think about it.
All right, let me go to the next question. And it's more of some sense political question, but a matter of policy involvement. It just simply asks, what's the role that governors should play in this? Anyone have thoughts? What should be the role of the governor? Greg.
I'm going to say, they should lead and demand accountability and performance, and try and do the things that we said. They have the bully pulpit to tell their broadband office to do things in a way that's going to be the best for all the citizens of the state and actually use the money efficiently. So that's my view. That's the role of the governor, is to set the precedent or set the expectations of what we should be doing.
And to add to that, obviously, they should never, ever come in and say, I have a friend who runs a company. The governor should never do that. And of course, we know that never happens. But I also think in terms of accountability, there is another side to that too, which is that when a program, when something doesn't work, that doesn't necessarily mean it was wrong, right? I mean, we're trying to get them to build networks in places that it wasn't possible or wasn't economic. Some of them aren't going to work. But the person, if there was a good structure for making the decisions, the person who made that decision should not necessarily be criticized, because, we're kind of talking about doing risky things. And so, having some that don't quite work if it was done properly and within the right framework, that's okay. And I think it's important for people to realize that too.
All right, our next audience question is a good one. All the others are good, of course, as well, but this one I had not thought about, so it stands out to me. So what steps can states take to limit the amount of money paid out to consultants? If you go back to the stimulus package that we'd been talking about before, the work there demonstrated that much of the money ended up in the pockets of consultants who were able to spin the bureaucratic wheels to get the grants. How can this be avoided in BEAD? And indeed, I saw cases of that. So who can give us some advice on that?
Well, so let me be entirely self-serving here and just point out that academics are typically cheaper than consultants. I mean, we are consultants, but we have lower overhead. And I forget who it was, maybe it was Scott, but he had the excellent suggestion of, a typical state has at least 2 major universities. Both of them probably have econ departments, right? Support them. There's probably some good people there that, whether they're industrial organization economists, public economics, public finance economists, these people have the empirical skills to do this stuff. And, hey, might even do it for free in exchange for data, right? Just find someone who doesn't have tenure yet, give them access, perhaps unique access to a data set that no one else has. And that's an attractive proposition.
So I would argue, first, you shouldn't do unique access because that would,
fair enough,
available. But second, I love your idea, but I think that states shouldn't have a single state doing it. They should have multiple states that have the same framework and the same data that you can actually work across. That would, there are economies of scale. Maybe, a consulting firm might do, or a university might cause more cost to do more than one state, but it's not going to be twice as much to do 2 states as it is to do 1 state. If you have a uniform framework for data reporting and other things like that, they can set up the framework and then apply it pretty easily. So I would suggest that's another way of doing it, is and of course create competition among the consultants too.
I was gonna make that point. It's exactly right. There's no reason why every state has to do it themselves. They can create groups of states, and also, whatever Jim is offering on overhead, we'll cut that in half. So think
reverse auction,
right? Exactly.
But I mean, also Scott made the point earlier. The questioner's good question notwithstanding, spending on consultants or evaluation, this has got to be a rounding error for the amount of money we're talking about here. So I get the question. I hesitate to think that this is going to be the biggest potential for waste, fraud, and abuse, as you spent 10% too much on some evaluation progress.
So let me. I think maybe we're answering the question incorrectly, which is we're thinking of consultants as evaluating the project, and they may be thinking of consultants as the people who go out and say, here's how you put together this project, and I'm a consultant that's going to look for demand and that sort of thing. And those kinds of consultants are there as well, I'm sure, and they may be a much bigger share of a project cost that they say, we're going to shepherd the cost through. So that's a different kind of consultant that we may not be answering that question.
Yeah,
I think that's a good point, because there are people running around trying to sell their services, and then people who trying to make decisions, who want to make the right decisions, but don't necessarily know how. I mean, why should they? They do a million other things, and that's got to be it could turn out to be a big issue, I think.
Yeah.
So if it's a demand stimulus consultant, just make it simple. Put a bounty on a new broadband household. Don't give them money for anything else than results.
I like it.
So let me just add that back when I was a regulator, and since I've been in academia as well, I've noticed many situations where different government officials across boundaries, whether country boundaries, state boundaries, whatever they might be, do pool resources. Because when you hire a consultant, when either you don't have enough manpower or you just need very specialized expertise. And so you go back when utility regulation was first being formed in Australia, the different provinces actually shared staff just because somebody'd get good at something and they would go around the other parts of Australia and help them all out. When I was a state regulator here in the United States on telecommunications, we collaborated with other states all the time to pool resources. This person over here is really an expert. Let's have him talk with or her talk with these other states. Or we worked with the FCC. It's world class in some of the work that it does. And so being able to pull resources there can be very helpful as well. All right, so I have just about 5 minutes left. Let me go to at least one more question. I don't see any more coming in from the audience. Let me go to this one, Jim. So it relates to some of the topics we've talked about. Yeah, as I described you, and I hope this doesn't embarrass you, you're the kind of guy that can make data cry. You can really get any information that's in a number out of the number, and all the false information that the data has, you don't get trapped in. You're very, very good at this. So you're good at this research. What are your recommendations for research topics that states should be looking towards, academics should be looking towards? We're going to be going down this path. How can people do work that evaluates and takes new lessons learned?
It's going to be a very long answer, but I'm not going to give that one. 2 quick points. So one is just we know a lot in modern econometrics now of how to do very convincing study designs, even when working with messy, non-experimental real-world data. If whoever, so just let me speak to potential people who are looking for others to do evaluations. If the person isn't mentioning a term like natural experiment or quasi-experiments, differences in differences, some of these other things, then just keep looking. So I would just mention that we just need more good quasi-experimental literature to be produced, evaluating all this. And I think with a scorecard in place, pointing people towards metrics and data, I think we'll see that. The other point I'll just make very briefly is, like, I'm not sure any person in government would actually want to do this, but certainly we should as economists, even if not. And that's just the question of, what's the efficiency cost of doing things various ways, right? The ultimate goal here of public policy is to increase the well-being of the citizens and the others living in the state. What's the most efficient way to do that? Is it through giving them a below-cost price for a specific good like broadband? Is it giving them a targeted subsidy? Is it giving general cash assistance? What is it? I mean, all these things that, there's various prices or costs to paternalism, right? The more specific and targeted the welfare sort of program, that typically has greater efficiency costs. What exactly are those costs? And I think that's something that hasn't been done for something as specific as all this broadband policy area that we've been looking at, but I think it's actually very important.
All right, very good. Well, thank you very much. So Janice, we're going to end with you. You're co-directing this particular project. What are your final words for our audience?
Final words are to take advantage of this information that is being put forward and to perceive it as it's intended, as a guide and as help, rather than as criticism that you seek to avoid. The goal is to improve along the lines of what Jim was just saying. Right? What are we trying to do? We want this to be successful. This is a lot of money, and we do not want to waste it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Jim, Greg, and Scott, also for your insights. They've been excellent, very, very helpful. The battle to do this well has been going on for a long time, and the end's not in sight. Let me thank also our AEI staff that have helped put all this together. Without them and the good work they do, nothing here would be happening at all. Let me thank everyone for being with us today. Please watch for future events with AEI, share your thoughts, and let us know what else you'd like to see our scholars do. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.